Shabbat Shalom. The Mishkan endeavor has a paradoxical quality to it because God had just said, no idols, no representations. And then God says, build this structure, this edifice in which will at least provide a vehicle in which I, God, can dwell amongst the people. And then, of course, they build kruvim, they build physical representations. It's a very strange and paradoxical structure. And I feel like the goal of the Mishkan is to create this vessel or this example of what it would mean to build a tzinor, a device or a pipeline that allows the divine to enter into the universe. Or even more, by being aware of the details of its structure, it symbolizes or represents the effort to try to have a sense that God's presence can actually manifest in the world in some kind of real world structure. In other words, we had this chance to fix everything that was broken in the Garden of Eden through this new thing that we could carry with us everywhere that we would go. And it's also interesting that the Mishkan is intentionally made not with iron, but with other materials. The Midrash says iron was never used because that which shortens the length of people should not have dominion over this endeavor, which is meant to lengthen the lives of humanity. Meaning the Mishkan has several purposes. One is to give us a sense that God dwells not in that building, but in our hearts, meaning it's a tzinor, right? Again, it's a pipe or a structure that lets the divine be carried or somehow contracted from its ineffable quality into the human soul. And in so doing, it actually lengthens our lives. There is, as an aside, a lot of good research suggesting that regular involvement at Kol Hamet or any church or synagogue will indeed lengthen your life. And then over time, that Mishkan endeavor evolves because our encounter with the world and the divine is always an evolutionary process. And it turns into the temple endeavor or experiment, which is different in several key ways, where the Mishkan is built by a great dedication of each person's heart. Indeed, people wanted to give so much to the Mishkan at a certain point, Moses had to say, no, stop, don't bring anything else. The temple, by contrast, involved forced taxes and levies of workers who had to build the thing. So suddenly, the Mishkan endeavor that's about bringing God into the world enters the realm directly of the political. And as it encounters the political, it uses the tools of politics, of taxes and force, to try to create something that can be even more wonderful, that can allow that sense of God's presence to be seen in sort of glory and majesty. And there's an argument to be made that the temple endeavor is a failure because it falls not once, but twice. And it falls, I think, in part because it entered too fully into the realm of political coercion. It moved away from its original intention, which is about helping us feel a sense of God, of the infinite, being able to be made manifest in each of our souls. To think, by the way, for a moment that architecture can be a vehicle by which we experience the divine is a wonderful assertion of the potential and the beauty and the aesthetic that can be had in a building and in a structure. I think we try to fulfill that in this space, that part of what it is to fill this space with our community. Do people notice the room, I feel like, is much more beautiful when it's filled with people than when it's empty? And that's intentional. Right? In other words, Stan did that on purpose. Because when we're here, we are creating a kind of energy or a place where the building can do what it's meant to do, which is help us feel a sense of God's presence entering into each of our souls. But the temple becomes also a symbol of Jewish nationalism and Jewish power and Jewish pride. When Herod builds the second temple, which was gorgeous and beautiful and one of the spectacular buildings of the ancient world, it was also showy. It was about making God manifest, but it was also about representing Herod's ego. It was about helping people to feel a sense of God's presence, and it was also about saying, we, the Israelites, have arrived, and look at this cool thing that we have built. And as a result, it was also vulnerable to the politics of the world in a way that the original Mishkan, in its movability, was much less so. And so it was destroyed both by the Babylonians and then later by the Romans. Meaning we failed, actually, as a Jewish people, to find a balance between the divine and the political. The temple that should have united our people became instead a place of sinat chinam, of divisions among Jews. The place that should have brought us close to the divine, at least in the first temple era, was also a hotbed of idolatry, meaning it failed on some level in a very difficult endeavor. It should have been a symbol of the divine and of freedom, and it became instead a manifestation of nationalism and pride. It seems to me that the effort of the state of Israel today is part of that temple and Mishkan endeavor. We call it the Jewish state, which means something. It's not just a place where there happens to be a majority of Jews, but rather we are trying to fashion a political entity that takes our 2,000-year history of ethics, of morality, and of faith, and make it manifest into the political institutions of a state. We are doing something that is both incredibly hopeful, remarkable, radical, and hard, which is to say we're going to take all these wonderful ideas that we held on to for 2,000 years of exile, and we're going to try to make them manifest in a state. We're going to try and say that it's possible to do something different in a state endeavor, that it's not just about coercive force and power, but actually it can stand for something that matters. I believe that this is a heavy burden to take on, and I'm a religious Zionist in this sense. I want to reuse those words. My relationship with the state of Israel is a deeply theological one, because I believe we as a people have something incredibly hopeful in mind to say that it might be possible to do something with a political entity that has never been seen before. It might be possible for us to fashion a state that is the Jewish state, that is a place where Jews can live and have as a refuge, and also that does actually draw from Jewish wisdom, tradition, and ethics in the way that it expresses the use and power of politics. But of course, the political realities and passion of power and nationalism bring up their inevitable challenges from the outside of exercising power, but also of defending the state must and have to immediately arise. And it creates a series of choices of how we may choose to react, especially when we have moments where we feel like the state is, yes, a state, but is not quite living up to what we hope or pray for as the Jewish state. So I think if we're going to be religious Zionists, in the sense that I want to understand, we have a few choices. The first is to turn away from what I term whataboutism. Whataboutism is when you talk about something Israel's doing that may be problematic, like having a government official say we should level Huwara, and people begin to say, well, what about how bad the people in Huwara were acting? They were throwing rocks and shooting gunfire at people who were driving by in cars. We're destroying the highway there, all of which is true. But it is whataboutism to say, what about? The question is, how can we understand the state of Israel, the Jewish state, responding to the challenge that that Palestinian city awoke in the politics? And I didn't like the response of Smotrich, and I detested the response of the rioters who attacked and burned elements and parts of the city down. So I think we should turn away from whataboutism, because the failures of the Palestinian community and its violence cannot be the moral yardstick against which we measure the state of Israel. Let me just say that again. People will sometimes say, look, it is anti-Semitism to say that Israel should act better than another state. That is anti-Semitism. And paradoxically, I kind of want Israel to act better than other states. Okay? I want it sort of both ways. And I refuse to measure the state of Israel's responses based on what terrorists and violent criminals are doing. I also refuse to give up. The judicial reforms that are being proposed right now have elements of necessity. There's a reason that almost 80% of Israelis support some kind of judicial reform, and that's because the court's powers, I wrote about it, I'm not going to go into all the details. The court's power has dramatically expanded since the 90s, and I think there is a need to create some limits. And requiring all of the justices to overturn any Knesset law, being able to write into a Knesset law that it is immune from judicial review, allowing the Knesset to overturn a ruling of the court by a simple majority. These are anti-democratic measures that will strike deeply at my hope to have not just a Jewish state, but a Jewish and democratic state. And it is true, and we have to understand that the nationalism and the frustration that's arising from Arab violence generally and Palestinian obstructionism in particular is then being expressed by particularly the Mizrahi community into a more aggressive posture towards Palestinians than we've seen in a long time. I believe Saudi Arabia reopening its relations with Iran is a warning of what this approach may bring to the state of Israel. So amid all of these problems, I choose hope. We spent 2,000 years fantasizing and dreaming and imagining that we could have again, not just a state, but a Jewish state. When you look at the Talmud and mystical writings, it is replete with fantasies that the new Israel will be a transformation of the political and the human condition. And while it is, of course, impossible to imagine that Israel can live up to all of those ideals, I refuse to give up on hope. I choose instead to say I will not give up. We need inspired leadership right now in the land of Israel that can find a new balance between Jewish values and democracy, that can figure out a way to bridge the gap that is emerging louder and louder between the secular and religious worlds, and also between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi communities. Much of what we're seeing expressed politically right now is about decades of Mizrahi frustration with Ashkenazi influences and systems of power. If you want to talk about systemic racism and the change, we're seeing a Mizrahi community that's pushing back against what they experienced as systemic racism for decades, and how we can begin to uncover a language that can both compromise on Ashkenazi supremacy in Israeli culture while preserving certain ideals of democracy and justice and freedom is a conversation that I guess I, as a rabbi, get to say I pray and I hope for. I don't know how we get there. We fantasize for 2,000 years with no realistic possibility of going to the land of Israel. Can you imagine sitting in Poland in the 13th or 14th century and saying, I pray for a day when there will be a land of Israel? Can you imagine after the Kishinev pogrom in 1905 saying, I pray and I hope that there will be a land of Israel? It's a fantasy, and a foolish fantasy, even as late as 1948. When Israel declared independence, many of us in the American Jewish community thought not only was the endeavor doomed to failure, but that we, the American Jewish community, weren't sure we wanted to support it. We were afraid of Jewish nationalism and Jewish power, and we were afraid that that would bring more anti-Semitism to us. The Jewish Theological Seminary did not stand up in that moment for the state of Israel. Neither did the Reform Seminary. Most synagogues didn't. There were places that did, but many, many people didn't. There was no promise, no guarantee that it would succeed. And so now that it is finding itself facing challenges that were sown from its very founding, Ben-Gurion created the state and he created the mess in which we're living right now, because he created a dynamic where the power of the religious was opened up in a way that didn't bring them fully into democratic Israel. He is also responsible of being one of the greatest leaders the Israeli people has known, and he also badly mistreated its Mizrahi now majority. He refused to allow Mizrahi families with multiple wives in Morocco and elsewhere to immigrate to Israel. There was a period in the early 50s where not everyone was being accepted by the Jewish state. Moroccan Jews were actually turned away. And so he sowed both the beauty of the state and also the challenges. And now, 75 years later, we are uncovering, or we are watching a conversation happen in Israel that to us and our American sensibilities is deeply and appropriately unsettling. And I turn now towards Israel in hope. I believe that there are voices in the Ashkenazi community and the Mizrahi community and the religious community. There was a protest of Israeli religious Jews, of Haredi Jews, who went and sang together the prayer for the state of Israel in the hope that Israel would remain Jewish and democratic. There is reason for hope, and there is no reason to give up. So I want to encourage us in this moment to pray for an outcome where Israel can retain its democracy and where Israel can also remember to be a force of peace and ethics in that region, to be a superpower not only in the military sense, but also a superpower in the ethical sense. I support Israel and elements in Israeli society that are fighting for a Jewish democracy. I support those who hope against hope to find a way toward Arab Israelis and Palestinians to find a real conversation that can lead us towards some kind of peace. And I know that there are elements of this that are fantasy, but Jews are good at hoping and fantasizing for a long time, and I'm not ready to give up by any means. So when we say and sing Hatikva, and when we say and sing the prayer for the state of Israel, we are hoping for the country of our dreams. We are hoping for a state that can find the inner resilience to resolve these kinds of conversations and to be able to create a state that is indeed a beacon of freedom, of ethical behavior, and an example to the world of what it means to wield the powers of its state. And every day that Israel fails to live up to that ideal, which by the way will be every single day ever, I will continue to hope and to pray that it will work harder and harder to find a path that will lead to that expression of a pure and wonderful state. So I'd like to invite us to sing Hatikva. I'd like us to sing it and renew our hope of what Israel can be and why we love and support Israel and our willingness to get into the hard work and our own responsibility in helping Israel be the place for which we hope and of which we dream. So I'd like to ask everyone to please rise. We're on page 448 if you want to follow along. Let's sing Hatikva. Kol od balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homia ulafate mizrach kadima ayin letzion Sophia od lo avda tikvatenu Hatikva bat shnot alpayim liotam chofshi be'artzeinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim liotam chofshi be'artzeinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim. As long as our Jewish hearts beat, we will support a state of Israel and try to bring about the Israel of our dreams. We will lead mixed gender conga lines at the Wall Plaza. We will support institutions and structures and people who are trying to put their lives on the line to build the Israel that we support and hope for. And we will continue to reaffirm our passion and our hope that to be a free people, liot am choshi, in our land, Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim. And let's all say, Amen. Let's remain standing. We definitely should turn to a moment of prayer. Page 184, Chatzi Kaddish, followed by, we'll join together the first couple of pages of the Musaf Amidah.
David, that was great. That was amazing. I believe